What's up guys? Welcome back to the channel and to another video. In this week's video, we'll be taking a look at the X part of this coffee table, and I'll go over in detail exactly how I made the X, how that half lap joint is formed, how to cut that out, and talk a little bit about all the tricks and secrets that you can use to get that to fit in there perfectly. All right, let's get this video started. So you might recognize this table if you follow my channel. In last week's video, I built this table with the domino. So in this week's video, we're gonna put that X in there like I mentioned. So the first thing you wanna do is measure the gap across those braces. So you can see there it was 22 inches. The board I've got here is 48 inches. So if I cut that in half, I'll have two 24-inch sections. It's important to cut it a little bit longer than what you actually need, and we'll take a look at why that is later in this video. But for right now, I cut this thing in half, and then it was over to the table saw to rip it into 4 pieces altogether. So the board that I've got that I'll be making this from is a little bit less than 5 inches wide. So rather than rip this in half, you want to rip this just a little bit less than half. That way you can rip the board that's on the outside that wasn't up against the fence. You can re-rip that to the same width as that first board was. If you try to rip it right in the middle, you might be off a little bit. So rip it a little bit less than under half, maybe 2 3/8 inches or so. That way you can get every piece the exact same width. So to make sure these boards are in place, I'm going to clamp them across the outside of the frame, and then we'll go on the inside frame and we'll trace that outline with a pin. I try to get them situated where they're right exactly in the center, so you can take one clamp off and slide it a little bit from side to side until you have it perfectly lined up where you want it. After that, all you do is trace the outline, and one trick that I like to do is to number each piece where they go. So you can see me marking a 1 here, and marking each piece where it goes will help me to keep these straightforward when I cut them and put them back in. So each corner will have a slightly different angle, and if you get them flip-flopped from end to end, they won't line up and they won't fit. So if you do this, go ahead and mark each piece in place to make sure that you know what end goes in what corner after you have everything cut. Here's an up-close look at the angles. We'll cut these off later, but for right now, we're going to use that little bit of extra board on the end to mark the depth of our miter saw for when we trench these out to form the half lap joint. So I marked somewhere around half the depth of the board on that previous shot, and then we'll use the depth gauge on the miter saw to line the depth of the saw blade up with that, and then we can cut out about half of that. The round blade makes this a little tricky. As you can see, the depth of the board is all the way back there, which the bottom of the blade doesn't reach. So we'll put a couple scrap blocks behind that, which will bring our board that we're cutting out a little further. That way the bottom of the blade can reach all the way across the gap we're going to cut out. So put that depth gauge down, and then on the outside of the board we're going to cut halfway down from the top. Here's a closer look, and what we're going to do to make this line up perfectly is flip that board over and then repeat the cut. So if there's any small little piece left, that means we need to adjust the depth gauge a little bit to where the saw blade will plunge just a little deeper until they finally line up. Whenever they finally do line up, you know that the boards will meet perfectly in the middle whenever we cut that half lap joint out, and that's how you get a perfect fit where they come across in the middle. So if you're way off, you can repeat this process until you finally get it. That's why I like to leave all that spare end at the end of the board, in case you're off big time and you need to make several repetitive cuts to finally get it lined up. So if you don't have a miter saw, or you prefer to do half lap joints on the table saw, you can do the exact same thing by flipping the board over, making those cuts until they finally line up on the end, which will give you the same result we just got with the miter saw. So the reason that we marked the depth was for when we cut the half lap joint out in the middle. Now that the depth is marked, we just want to cut these angles off the ends so that they'll fit in the corners of the main table frame. With those angles cut out, all you want to do is put it in place, tap it with the hammer a couple times gently on each corner, and then it pops into place. If it seems like it's not going to fit or it's a little too long, it's okay to recut those on the end. Sometimes that angle will be off just a little bit and you'll have to recut one edge. Once both pieces are in place, you just take a pen and you trace the outline just like we did on those corners, and then this will be where that half lap joint forms, so that's the part that we'll cut out using the depth gauge that we measured earlier. Here's a look at those lines that we made when they were overlapped, and the nice thing about these is that the angle will match up and be the same on each board, so you only have to adjust the saw's angle once. Now all we're going to do is trench out the middle of that half lap joint. You want to leave the line, so only cut inside the lines, and a really important part here is to make sure that you do have that depth gauge down, otherwise you'll cut right through the board and ruin the piece. I've actually done that quite a few times, so I'm speaking from experience when I say make sure you have the depth gauge down, otherwise you get to do it all over again. One more tip here on this step is to go slow. This footage is sped up a whole lot. This is not a place you want to get in a hurry, so take your time, go slow on those cuts, and make sure that the saw blade is completely up and not touching the piece whenever you slide the piece to make the next part of the cut. After the half laps are cut out, I'll usually grab a file and file down the inside just to get a better glue surface and get rid of any of the rough spots left by the saw blade. At this point, I'll grab the hammer and make sure that these dry fit together. You don't want to force it with the hammer, but don't be afraid to hit it to get everything in place. You don't want to break it though, so if it feels like it's not going, take it back out, file it down or recut it, and make sure that they fit well at this point. The last step before it goes into the frame was to take a roundover bit and just clean up and detail those edges a little bit. It doesn't necessarily pertain to this aspect of the video, but since all the other edges on the coffee table had been rounded over, I wanted to make that look the same, so I hit it with a roundover bit on the router. To make sure that the X stays put in place and doesn't get up and walk away, I put a little bit of glue in each corner and then I tap this in place. You don't need a ton of glue, especially if your angles are cut really well and everything lines up, but the wood will shift a little bit over time, so glue will help it stay put. If the half lap joint seems to come apart a little bit whenever you're tapping it with the hammer, you can always influence it back into place with a clamp, which is what I did there. After that, just wipe everything down to make sure you get rid of any of the glue that's left over, because if you're staining this, that will show through. So what we do on one side, we obviously must do on the other, because if we didn't, this would kind of be a weird looking coffee table and I don't know that anyone would like it. So I put the X on the other side using the same process, and then to make sure that the X's stay secured, I just put a screw through the frame of the top piece into the X. I did pre-drill these, and I know I was trying to avoid using screws and only use dominoes on this build, but I couldn't figure out a way to put a domino in that corner or that angle. Plus the screw would be hidden, so nobody will ever know about it unless they watch this video. And now that you've watched this video, you are a half lap joint expert, so thank you for watching. I hope you found everything in this video helpful. If you did, drop a comment below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and as always, stay tuned for more.